Okay, so my initial impressions of the team associated SC5M, it's good in short. Few things that I did end up changing from the manual setup. One thing a friend of mine recommended to me is to use shock O-rings here on the body mount post, and this keeps the body from rattling around. It also helps the body mount a little bit more tightly. So this is quite a useful little tip here. The manual tells you to set the shock collar gap to the top of the shock to somewhere around 11 millimeters or so, front and rear, and that should give you about a 30 millimeter front ride height and 28 millimeter rear ride height, which is what the box stock setup is. It turns out, at least for the electronics that I'm using a shorty pack and a Novak, what the hell is this thing? This is a Novak Edge speed control. It's a relatively light speed control, relatively light battery. It's not a square pack, it's a shorty. It's not quite enough weight to really push the chassis down, so I had to go back off quite a bit on the preload spacers, the shock collars here, somewhere around 5 millimeters or so in the rear, and I think about 3 millimeters or so up front. So that's a very drastic change from the manual suggestion of about 11 to 11.75 or something like that, front and rear. So I mean, always, when you put these cars together, it's important to double check the ride height, the camber, the towing, all of that stuff. So this is just another example of that, right? Make sure your preload settings are correct. The manual isn't always correct with the preload settings. Now, that being said, I would also go a little further and say that the manual, the box stock setup, appears to be meant for a high grip track. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the B5M factory light and the SC5M, and I imagine also the T5M will be very similar, they all come with 32.5 weight oil, and they want you to use that front and rear. Now, in the past, if you had something like maybe a B5, or if you had a B4 or a T4, the oil weight you would use would be very different. They suggest something like 25 weight rear, 30 weight front. So the kit is giving you an oil that's heavier and asking you to use the same oil front and rear, especially at the rear. It's a lot heavier oil. So you would only really need that kind of a heavy oil at the rear if you really want a lot of steering and if you have quite a lot of traction on the actual track surface. And I stuck with the 32.5 weight rear oil just to see what it's like. I still have it in there. What I did find is, at least on the track that I was racing at today, that the truck did slide quite a bit around corners, so I had too much steering. And one way to alleviate that is to drop the rear roll center. Now, the reason why I did that is because the reason why the truck had too much steering wasn't necessarily because the front had too much grip. It was because the rear did not have enough grip and the rear was sliding out. So if I drop the rear roll center by increasing the height of the inner ball stud here, maybe a little hard to see, there we go. So this inner camber link ball stud, I just added two 1 millimeter aluminum spacers under the ball stud, and that drops the roll center, and that helps the rear roll a little more. So even though the oil's a bit thicker than what I'm used to using, by dropping the roll center, I get the chassis to roll a bit more, kind of as if the car had lighter rear oil. But I have the benefit of maintaining jumping performance. With the heavier oil, I get more pack than with lighter oil, so it lands better. Now, the downside of this is the rear ends up being a little bit lazier, so you have to be smoother with your steering inputs. But overall, I found this particular change to the setup on the track that I run at to be incredibly helpful. I was actually traction rolling on corners where I was previously sliding out. And all I had to do was just increase the inner camber link ball stud height by 2 millimeters, and that was it. Other than that, the rest of this is a box stock setup. I'm running the shorty pack all the way to the rear, so all the phone spacers are up front. I'm pretty happy with it. We didn't have quite enough of a turnout to have a full 17.5 short course race today, so it was actually a combination of stock short course, modified two-wheel short course, and modified stadium truck that just took all the trucks and put them in one class. I ended up finishing third in the A-main, but first among the stock short course trucks. So I'm quite pleased with that, considering this is my first run with this truck, and I haven't run two-wheel short course in quite some time. The only, let's see, yes, gearing, I'm running a 27 tooth pinion with the, I think it comes with a 75 tooth spur, whatever spur they tell you to use for stock. I'm running a Trinity D4 17.5. This is a 1S short stack motor, and I have the static timing set to about 55 degrees. I started off a little conservative and ran at 40 degrees, and I found it was, I mean, you get a little bit more torque coming out of corners, but the high end is just not quite enough. So I set it back to the stock setting of which is about 55 degrees, and this seems just fine. The motor didn't come off too hot. And what I do notice, what's kind of interesting to me actually, is the amount of punch that I have depends less on gearing and timing and more on my batteries. If I have a battery that's a year old and I run it in this, it'll run okay, but I don't get quite the amount of punch that I would need to consistently, say, clear a triple throughout an entire 6-minute main. But if I run a brand new pack, the chemistry is fresher, so the battery, the voltage sag, or I guess it's called voltage sag, is much lower. So I maintain a higher voltage over a larger fraction of the discharge period, and I get a lot more punch. So if you find in your own case, and this is just generic to stock in general, short course buggy, you're not getting enough punch to clear jumps where other people are clearing the same jumps and they're also running a stock motor, check your battery. If your battery's old, consider getting a new battery. That will make a way bigger difference in my own experience than fiddling with the gearing and timing. Now, of course, you do have to make sure your gearing and timing is set appropriately, but also make sure you have a good battery. Let's see, what else? That's pretty much it. Wear and tear was really non-existent. Truck did get a bit dirty, but you would expect that running on a dirt track. No broken parts, no bent parts. Overall, I was running, pretty clean throughout the day, as I usually do or try to do. These aluminum chassis are, always prone to wearing down quite a bit. So you can see, based on the reflection of the light here, there's a bit of wear at the rear. So this is after one day of running, but all things considered, I would actually say, maybe that's not the right way to light this. I'll just keep this upside down here. This is actually a pretty small amount of wear for a single day of running. It's just a little scraped at the rear. And the rear is always something to check, right? I noted on, for example, my Losi 22.4 that the amount of bottoming out that the rear had with the stock setup there was a concern. Also, actually, I happen to have my Kyosho laser right here. The way that the rear of the chassis has worn on this after a couple of runs was quite concerning. Now this has more to do with suspension setup and ride height. Short course trucks ride a lot higher because they have bigger tires, so you're less likely to bottom out and scrape the bottom of the chassis. So wear and tear on the aluminum chassis is very good after a first day of running. It's hard to say the same for buggies because they have a lower ride height. Okay, so those are my first impressions, and that's it. So thanks for watching.